I think in the short term, prescriptive is what we're going to focus on, but when we're considering infection risk, there are so many factors that go into determining what acceptable risk is that I think we would like to have a standard that allows users to determine what their own risk tolerance is and to develop requirements that are based on those. That's one aspect of performance versus prescriptive. The other is a prescriptive standard might say you must use outdoor air to achieve your target, or you must use a certain type of equipment. And something that we learned in the Epidemic Task Forces was that there was a real advantage to allowing flexibility on the part of the user to meet their goals. So in one climate, more outdoor air might be a really good solution to reducing exposure indoors, but in another one where the climate is extreme, that might be a very expensive way of doing it. So to that extent, we'd like to have performance objectives in terms of the equivalent outdoor air requirements that can be met with technologies that will help the owners achieve other goals like energy goals and first cost and operating cost goals. Well, design versus operation, writing standards for design typically applies to the next building or to an addition to a building or to a major renovation. And what percentage of the building stock is new every year? It's a single-digit percentage that's new. So that's one reason for going beyond design to operation, so that you have a standard that will say something about what existing buildings should do. And the other reason for having operation called out specifically is that we know that no matter how well designed buildings may be, they fail in operation. We've seen that in many contexts before. If systems are not even doing what they were supposed to, it's kind of a futile goal to make them even better. Ultimately, what we want is not a standalone national infection risk mitigation standard. At least that's my personal view of it. What we really need are national indoor air quality model standards. And so my hope is that 62.1, 62.2, with upgrades, with amendments based on 241, can become those standards eventually. As we've seen what happens in the energy arena when you have national model standards like the IACC and N90.1. I'm hopeful that if we had a similar situation for indoor air quality, that we would see more consistent and widespread progress than we've seen over the last 50 years or so. The relationship currently to the other standards, 62.1, 62.2, 170, is that we're going to write the standard essentially on top of them. So requirements in 241P will assume that the minimum standard that applies for air quality is being met. So if you have a non-residential, non-healthcare building, of an office building or something of that sort, compliance with 62.1 is kind of taken as given as the baseline, and so we're working on how would you go beyond that, and a little bit in the way that maybe 189.1 goes beyond 90.1 for energy and 62.1 for air quality. But the big question is, how will those standards ultimately change? Because those are the ones that are referenced in codes and other similar documents, especially 62.1 that is basis for ventilation rates in the main model code. And that's not really within the scope of the 241P committee, but we have participation on the committee from people who are very involved in 62.1, 62.2, and 170. And as one of our activities, we will be discussing with them how we might move some of the 241 requirements into those standards. What you need to understand is that if you're going to change those ANSI standards to include provisions that deal with infection risk mitigation, you actually have to change the title, purpose, and scope of the standard to say that that is something that is included. So how that will happen, I can't really say yet. I can imagine a process that might start with addenda. So you could have a formative appendices for these standards that would be information that could be used by a user of the standard if they wanted to include requirements in their design that would address infection risk. The big leap is going from informative appendices to actual standard content, and that will proceed by the normal ANSI process, I think. I want to emphasize that, because we're trying to take on really an unprecedented task in a short period of time, a combination of two things, really difficult problem and much less time than you would really like to have to do it. We're thinking already down the road to what else will need to be done once we get the first version out. The intent is certainly that the first version is a meaningful contribution to the industry that will help us do the things that need to be done, but there are certainly going to be ways in which it can be expanded and enhanced beyond what we're targeting in the first version. Let me start by saying that there's a big difference between enforceable and enforced. So we can write a standard in code language that if there was a jurisdiction that wanted to adopt it, it would say things in a way that is consistent with what you need to have in a code. Not, it would be nice if you did, or you should or could do. It has to say, this is what you shall do, what you need to do. So we're taking care of that. The next question is, how will authorities adopt it? The construction codes that we talk about so much really stop at design. So they regulate how the building is designed, and after that, in most cases, there's no further regulation. So I think the ultimate successful adoption of standards like this is when the authorities put in place a structure that addresses operation as well as design, but that's different entities. The design standard relates to the owner and how much they have to pay for a building, and to the professionals and how they have to design the system. Now we're dealing with who is the tenant or the later owner of the building, and do they have to periodically evaluate and report how their building is operating. And so that's more of a policy making issue that is really out of ASHRAE's hands, but we hope that we will write something that is viewed as providing a feasible path to an acceptable to most level of regulation. I would make the analogy to energy. So we used to have the same situation for energy. Build the building, and then what happens afterwards, who knows? But we're seeing more and more requirements to report building energy use, and that is moving in the direction of some degree of regulation and enforcement, that if your building isn't up to standards, you may at some point, if you don't improve it, have to pay a penalty. I'm not saying I want to see people paying penalties for not meeting an operational standard, but ultimately that is the best insurance that those things will actually happen. It's much shorter than the normal standard development process, which often takes several years, 3 years, 4 years, can be even longer than that. So obviously the urgency is tied in part to what the government would like to see. They would like to have be able to say that there are standards available that will help to reduce risk of infection transmission in buildings as we come out of the COVID restrictions that we've had for several years. So when all of that is lifted, I think there's a desire to know that we have learned something from the experience, that we've put in place protections that will help ensure that it doesn't happen again. Real driver for doing it now and for having a short timeline is the relationship that developed between ASHRAE and the government, and specifically the White House, during the current administration. So the White House recognized the importance of indoor air quality and came out in the first part of last year with the Clean Air in Buildings Challenge, and we had already had some discussions going on with the COVID Task Force in the White House about standards, and in November the White House had some meetings with ASHRAE leadership, and that led to ASHRAE agreeing to develop on a fairly tight timeline a standard that would address infection risk mitigation in buildings, kind of in support of the White House's programs. One of the key things in any consensus standard effort, which this is to get a committee that is sufficiently diverse in all respects. So we have experts that cover the whole range of things that we need to be concerned about. We've got researchers who study airborne transmission, who study air movement in buildings. We have public health experts. We have consulting engineers who design buildings and commission buildings. And we even have those who own and maintain buildings. So we set up a group that can address all of the areas that we had defined as important, and we've broken that committee up into a number of working groups and put clusters of expertise in each of them. So risk assessment, air distribution, air cleaning, commissioning, operation, and maintenance, residential buildings, and healthcare buildings. And the reason for having those two occupancy-specific groups is that those are the two types of occupancy where we actually expect to have occupants who are infected with some disease who need to be cared for, isolated, and also protecting others who are not infected in the same buildings.